J.D. Vance pulled off the main road and into the gravel lot of a diner that looked like it had been standing in the same spot for decades. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, its once bright letters dulled by time and weather. The smell of grilled meat and brewed coffee drifted through the slight opening of the door as customers came and went, carrying the comforting aroma out into the cool evening air. He was tired. The kind of tired that settled deep in the bones, the result of long hours spent in back-to-back meetings, firm handshakes, and careful conversations that required as much patience as they did restraint. His mind was still running through the day's events, but all he wanted now was a quiet meal, something simple before the long drive back. Inside, the diner was exactly what he expected. The kind of place that locals clung to, where time moved slower, and the world outside mattered less. The booths were filled with familiar faces, the counter lined with men nursing cups of coffee, their conversations blending into the steady hum of the room. A corkboard by the register displayed a collage of old Polaroids, smiling couples, birthday celebrations, a few faded snapshots of the staff over the years. It was the kind of place where routine wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. At first, everything felt normal. The clatter of silverware against plates, the low murmur of casual conversation, the sizzle of something frying in the kitchen. But as soon as he stepped forward, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. A ripple, like the surface of a still pond disturbed by a single drop. The woman behind the counter had started to smile, one of those automatic, polite expressions worn by people who had spent years greeting customers. But as soon as she recognized him, the corners of her mouth hesitated, her expression freezing for a fraction too long before settling into something more neutral. It wasn't hostility, not outright, but something more complicated. A flicker of uncertainty, as though she was trying to decide how to proceed. He had seen it before. That split-second pause when someone wasn't sure if they should be pleased or uncomfortable. He didn't acknowledge it, didn't let his own expression change. Instead, he took a slow glance around the room. The regulars had noticed him now. Not all at once, but in pieces, a glance over the shoulder, a whisper between bites of food, the slight stiffening of postures that came when people suddenly became aware of something unexpected in their space. A man at the counter, midway through a bite of his sandwich, stopped chewing for a second longer than necessary. A woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down a little too hard, the ceramic clink just loud enough to punctuate the moment. A group in the corner lowered their voices, their conversation thinning into something quieter, more deliberate. J.D. kept his movements slow, measured. He wasn't new to tension, wasn't unfamiliar with being the center of attention in a room where opinions had already been formed before he even had a chance to say a word. He had spent enough time in places just like this to know when he wasn't entirely welcome. And yet, here, in a roadside diner, in a town not much different from the one he grew up in, the weight of that realization settled differently. It wasn't anger. There was no outright hostility, no one standing up to confront him. But there was something else in the air. A quiet, collective hesitation. A decision waiting to be made. He exhaled slowly, letting the moment pass without reacting to it. He had come here for a meal, not a conversation. Not an argument. And so he let his shoulders relax, his hands resting at his sides as he turned his attention back to the counter. The hostess was still standing there, her hand unconsciously brushing against the edge of the register, as though grounding herself. Whatever expression had crossed her face before was gone now, replaced with something more carefully composed. She straightened slightly, glancing toward the kitchen, as if seeking silent confirmation before stepping forward. There was no need for words yet. Not yet. But the message in the room was clear. He wasn't just another customer here. And everyone knew it. J.D. remained standing near the counter, his presence a quiet disruption to the otherwise steady rhythm of the diner. The room had settled into a kind of expectant stillness, a collective pause where no one spoke but everyone listened. The hostess, who had hesitated upon recognizing him, now seemed more certain of whatever decision she was about to deliver. She offered a brief, tight nod before turning away, disappearing through the swinging door that led to the kitchen. The air felt heavier in her absence. Conversations that had once hummed in the background were now distant, muffled beneath the weight of anticipation. A man at the counter shifted in his seat, his posture stiff as he traced the rim of his coffee cup with one calloused thumb. A booth near the window had gone still, its occupants no longer pretending to be absorbed in their meals. Even the soft clang of a spatula against a griddle in the kitchen had stopped, replaced by the distant murmur of voices behind the closed door. J.D. remained motionless, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady. He had stood in rooms filled with tension before, places where the temperature of a conversation could shift in an instant. He recognized the signs, the sideways glances, the slight straightening of shoulders, the way people prepared themselves for something they weren't sure they wanted to witness but couldn't quite ignore. The door to the kitchen swung open again, and the hostess returned. This time, she carried herself differently. No more hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Whatever conversation had happened in the back had solidified her stance. She stepped forward, shoulders squared, her voice even but firm as she spoke. No long-winded excuse. No attempt to soften the words. Just a clear, unyielding decision: they would not be serving him tonight. The statement landed like a stone dropping into a still pond, rippling outward. A few people looked down at their plates, pretending they hadn't heard. Others stared outright, their eyes flicking between J.D. and the hostess, waiting to see what would happen next. The man at the counter let out a slow exhale, his fingers tightening around the ceramic handle of his mug. J.D. absorbed the weight of the moment in silence. The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning beyond what was spoken. There was no mention of a policy, no claim of closing early, no logistical excuse. Just a decision, delivered with a finality that left little room for argument. His expression remained unreadable. There was no sharp intake of breath, no shift in stance that suggested anger or indignation. He had encountered rejection before, had learned over time that the true power in any situation often lay in how one chose to respond. He let a beat pass before lifting his gaze to meet the hostess's. There was no malice in her face, no overt hostility, but there was a certainty there, one that did not waver, even under the weight of the silence that followed her words. Instead of pushing back, instead of raising his voice or demanding an immediate explanation, he made a choice. He asked a single question. A calm, measured inquiry, spoken with the same steadiness he had carried into 100 other rooms where tension clung to the air like smoke. The reaction was immediate. The hostess hesitated, not as she had before, but just enough for the shift in the room to become more pronounced. Someone near the back scoffed softly, the sound barely cutting through the quiet. A man near the window leaned forward, resting an elbow on the table, a slow grin spreading across his face as though he had been waiting for this moment. At the counter, the old man with the work jacket barely moved, but his eyes lifted from his plate. He didn't turn his head, didn't engage, but something in his posture suggested he was listening. Others exchanged quick glances, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected response. The hostess, still composed but not unaffected, flicked her gaze toward the kitchen as if searching for silent confirmation. She didn't immediately walk away this time. The moment stretched just long enough for the weight of it to settle, for the realization to set in that this was not going to be as simple as closing the door on an unwanted guest. J.D. didn't move. He didn't push. He simply waited. And the room, whether they realized it or not, waited with him. The door behind the counter swung open again, and this time, it wasn't the hostess who stepped out. The man who emerged carried himself differently, broad-shouldered, arms crossed over a grease-streaked apron, his expression a mask of practicality rather than warmth. His presence was an answer in itself. The kind of man who had spent years running this place, who had seen every type of customer come and go, and who now stood at the threshold of a decision he didn't seem entirely comfortable making. J.D. took in the moment, the small shift in energy as the manager, Don, according to the name tag pinned to his chest, approached. There was no rush to speak, no urgency to fill the silence. The room had already decided that this was worth paying attention to. Even those who had pretended to be lost in their meals had stopped eating, their forks hovering just above their plates. A low murmur of voices had settled into something closer to stillness. Don didn't waste time. His words came out measured, practical, and yet, beneath them, there was something else. Not aggression, not outright hostility, but an edge sharpened by the weight of unspoken things. He wasn't pretending this was a misunderstanding. He wasn't offering a neat excuse. This wasn't personal, he said, but at the same time, it absolutely was. JD absorbed the statement without reaction. He had been in enough rooms to recognize when a decision was being presented as a foregone conclusion, when the people involved were more interested in maintaining the stance they had taken than questioning how they got there. But he also knew something else: there was hesitation. Not much, but just enough. The kind of hesitation that revealed itself in the way Don's jaw tightened before speaking, in the way his fingers curled slightly against his apron. It wasn't just about JD. It wasn't just about one decision. It was about the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The room seemed to shift around them. A younger man, seated in the booth nearest the counter, leaned back, his arms crossed in amusement, like he was watching something unfold exactly as he had expected. The older man at the counter, the one in the worn-out work jacket, didn't look up from his plate, but his chewing had slowed, as if listening was now more important than eating. JD let the tension settle before responding. There was no demand in his voice, no challenge, just a question, not combative, not defensive, but precise. The kind of question that didn't need to be asked if the answer was obvious. Don hesitated, just for a second. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for a small shift in weight, a subtle glance toward the kitchen, a brief flicker of thought before his mouth set into a firm line once more. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. From the booth, the younger man scoffed, shaking his head like this was all predictable. He was enjoying the moment, waiting for the inevitable retreat, waiting for someone to break. His body language was relaxed, but there was something in his expression, something closer to satisfaction. JD remained steady. He had no intention of leaving, but he had no intention of escalating either. That wasn't what this moment required. He wasn't here to prove a point through force. The weight of expectation settled over Don's shoulders. He had made a decision, but now he was being asked to examine it. The silence of the diner pressed against him, waiting. The cooks in the back, the waitress behind the counter, the customers who had arrived only for a meal, all of them now part of something larger than their original intentions. Don exhaled, a slow breath that didn't quite ease the tension in his frame. He shifted his stance slightly, as if suddenly aware of the room's attention. JD didn't move. He didn't press further. He simply allowed the space to remain open, allowed Don a choice of what came next. And for the first time that night, the outcome of this moment no longer felt inevitable. The diner held its breath, the weight of the moment pressing against the walls, the windows, the people sitting at their tables pretending not to watch. The tension in Don's posture suggested he had expected an argument, a raised voice, some inevitable flash of anger that would allow him to stand firm in his decision. But when JD moved, it wasn't to leave. Instead, he sat. The sound of the chair's legs scraping against the tile was oddly sharp in the quiet. It cut through the thick silence, through the low murmur of a radio playing somewhere in the kitchen, through the expectation that this conversation had already run its course. But now, it hadn't. Now, it was just beginning. A shift moved through the room. It wasn't relief, wasn't exactly discomfort either, but something in between. A diner was supposed to be a place of easy conversations, of simple interactions, of routine. This wasn't that. This was something no one quite knew how to react to. Don watched JD with an expression that was harder to read now. The confidence in his earlier words had been clear, but now, there was uncertainty at the edges. The younger man in the booth still wore amusement on his face, but it had dulled just slightly, as if he had been waiting for a more predictable reaction and was now unsure what to do with what was actually happening. JD didn't rush. He didn't try to fill the space with defenses or justifications. He simply sat there, calm, his presence not as an intruder but as a participant. The unspoken rules of confrontation, raised voices, quick tempers, inevitable exits, had been rewritten in an instant, and it left everyone scrambling to adjust. The conversation that followed didn't unfold in the way arguments usually did. It didn't spiral into accusations or dissolve into platitudes. Instead, the focus shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. It was no longer just about one man sitting at a counter, no longer just about whether he should be served or turned away. The discussion deepened, moving into something larger, something older, something that had been simmering long before JD had stepped through the door. The grievances in the room were not new. They had existed in the bones of the town for years, in the shuttered businesses, in the factories that had once provided security and now stood empty. In the promises made by men in suits, hands shaken in front of cameras, assurances spoken with conviction only to be forgotten once the motorcade had disappeared down the highway. It wasn't just about politics, it was about exhaustion. About the weight of feeling unheard, unseen. About the sense that no matter what changed, nothing really did. At the counter, the old man in the work jacket finally lifted his gaze from his plate. His fork remained motionless, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. His silence had been deliberate, the kind of silence that wasn't indifference but observation. Now, though, he was watching. The waitress, who had spent the last several minutes pretending to wipe down the same spot on the counter, stopped moving altogether. The two cooks in the back exchanged glances, one of them shifting his weight as if debating whether to step closer. JD listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't redirect. He let the frustration in the room take shape, let it build into something real, something tangible. He had heard these complaints before, but hearing them now, in this space, from these people, it was different. Because this wasn't a debate. This was a conversation that had been waiting to happen. Even Don, who had been so certain of his stance, seemed less sure now. His arms were still crossed, but his posture had changed, less rigid, more contemplative. He wasn't defending his decision as much as he was trying to justify it to himself. Trying to find solid ground in an argument that had started to feel shakier than he had anticipated. The younger man in the booth, who had been the first to scoff, still carried skepticism in his expression, but there was something else now too. He wasn't leaning back as comfortably as before. He was listening, even if he wouldn't admit it. The air in the diner wasn't as thick as it had been before. It hadn't fully eased, but something in it had shifted, settled into something closer to recognition. Maybe not agreement. Maybe not acceptance. But understanding? Maybe. And for the first time, the moment wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about being heard. The moment stretched, long and weighty, but not in the same way it had before. The air inside the diner was still thick with unspoken thoughts, but it was different now, not tense, not hostile, just considering. JD remained seated, his presence no longer the disruption it had been when he first walked in, but something else entirely. Then, from the counter, a voice broke through the silence. Low, steady, spoken more as an observation than an invitation for discussion. The old man in the work jacket barely lifted his head as he muttered it, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, his tone carrying the kind of finality that came from years of experience. The words landed in the space between them, weightier than they had any right to be. The reaction wasn't immediate. It rolled through the room in a slow ripple. A pause. Then, somewhere in the background, a short, unexpected chuckle. Not loud, not forced, just a natural release of something that had been building. A sound that wasn't exactly laughter, but something close to it. JD didn't move. He simply let it settle. Don exhaled, shifting slightly, his fingers drumming once against his apron. He didn't look at JD right away. Instead, his gaze flicked toward the others, toward the older man at the counter, toward the waitress still hovering near the register, toward the younger guy in the booth who had gone from entertained to uncertain. He was weighing something, considering. And then, just like that, the moment tipped. The decision didn't come in the form of an apology, didn't come with some grand statement or admission. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, wasn't an admission of being wrong or right. Instead, it came as a simple concession, an acknowledgement of something unspoken. A shift, small but undeniable. The waitress hesitated at first, but when the quiet expectation in the room became too much to ignore, she moved. A hand reached for a menu. Fingers slid it across the counter. The laminated pages reflected the dim glow of the overhead lights as they landed in front of JD. He didn't grab it right away. He let it sit there for a moment, let the room absorb what had just happened. The younger man in the booth still looked skeptical, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. The cooks in the kitchen weren't pretending to ignore what was happening anymore, their eyes flicking between Don and JD as if trying to understand the shift themselves. But the conversation hadn't been for them, not entirely. It had been for Don. JD finally reached for the menu, flipping it open with an ease that suggested he had expected this outcome all along, even if no one else had. The tension in the room wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had softened. It had settled into something more manageable, something closer to the quiet hum of normalcy. The order was placed, and the kitchen, after a moment's hesitation, returned to its usual rhythm. The sizzle of the griddle resumed, the scrape of metal against metal filling the spaces where silence had once lingered. Conversations, though quieter, began to pick up again. A coffee cup was refilled. A chair creaked as someone shifted their weight. When the plate finally arrived, it was simple, classic diner fare, nothing fancy, nothing special. Just a meal. The kind of meal that had been served here 1,000 times before, to 1,000 different people, none of whom had ever needed to fight for it. JD picked up the burger, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. The room, though more relaxed, was still watching. Then, with the same calm, measured presence he had carried through the entire night, he made an observation. Casual. Unremarkable. Just a passing comment. And for the first time since he had walked through the door, Don let out a short, unexpected laugh. It wasn't forced, wasn't uncomfortable. It was real. A few others joined in, not loudly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to mark the difference between what had been and what now was. The younger guy in the booth shook his head, but there was something different in his expression. The waitress, still cautious, poured JD another cup of coffee. The old man at the counter finally took another bite of his meal, as if signaling that, for him at least, this conversation was over. It wasn't resolution, not completely. It wasn't acceptance, wasn't agreement. But it was something. And in a world where most people were too quick to shout, too unwilling to listen, something was more than enough.